Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Brendan Cole. David Cameron has said there is a real opportunity to end extreme global poverty within the next few decades. Last week, the British Prime Minister co-chaired a meeting of politicians from around the world to discuss anti-poverty strategies. Mr. Cameron has been asked by the UN to look into how poverty in developing countries should be tackled after 2015. He's reaffirmed his pledge to increase Britain's aid budget to 0.7% of gross national income. Meanwhile, the International Development Secretary will this week unveil plans to slash Britain's controversial £280 million a year budget to India, amid claims the country is too rich to need handouts. The move also comes amid mounting criticism that Britain's overseas aid programme, which is set to reach more than £12 billion by 2014, cannot be justified at a time of spending cuts back home. So, just what should be the UK's role in providing aid to developing countries? Should it give more? Should it ask for more in return? Well, to discuss this and other issues, I'm joined by Alex Scrivener, who's the Policy Officer for the World Development Movement, which campaigns on issues of global justice and development in the Global South. Laura Taylor, who's Head of Public Policy at the Relief and Development Agency Tear Fund. Robert Oxley, who's Campaign Manager at Taxpayers Alliance. And on the line, we have David Lipsey, who's a member of the Economic Affairs Committee in the House of Lords. Thank you very much for joining me on The Voice of Russia. Robert Oxley, I'll start with you. It does seem a bit daft, doesn't it, to be giving £250,000 a year to a country that has a space programme?
Well, we have long argued that the aid budget can be spent in a more appropriate way, and I think the fact that Justine Greening, the Secretary of State for International Development, has recognised that she needs to cut back on the funds, the £280 million a year that goes to India, proves that point. The point here, though, is that the government still is waiting a while to get rid of this programme. It's up until 2015 that the aid budget will continue on to India, and I think at a case when all government departments are having to make necessary savings and they're having to do more for less, the idea that the international aid budget should also be protected from those pressures. It's not about cutting aid, it's about saying that we can do more with what we've got at the moment. And India, a country which has a space program, which spends money on defence projects such as the latest fighter jets, why is it that we are handing money over to there to rightly address poverty, but why is it not India's own responsibility to do that?
Laura Taylor, what do you make of this, the issue of giving aid to India?
Picking up on what Robert said, I think it is really important that it's the debate really focuses at the moment about whether or not we should be giving 0.7% in aid. And I think David Cameron has really strongly said that he feels there's a public mandate to do that and he's committed to doing it. But the debate about how to spend that 0.7% is a really valid and genuine one to have. And at Tear Fund ourselves, we've been thinking about which countries we do and don't support aid to. Now, India's a really interesting case because although there is encouraging and really quick economic growth, which is great, there's still more people living on less than $1 a day in India than there is in the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. So although that growth is happening, more does need to be done to make sure that it's spread out more evenly to help the people living in greatest need. So it might be genuinely the case that the UK should exit aid to India, and that's what we've stated, the government stated they'll do. But how we do that, making sure that the most marginalised are protected, is really important. And I think that's why they're staggering that exit. For us, we've decided to focus on the most vulnerable, people living with HIV, children who might be trafficked, or education for the most marginalised, like the Dalits. So I think it's a good debate to have, but we mustn't forget the poorest.
Alex Scrivener, does this go to the heart of the effectiveness of who the UK decides to give aid to?
What we've got to remember with India is that it's not the amount that we give necessarily that's very important, it's what we're spending the money on. And I think we've also got to remember that in India, we've got a country which is incredibly rich as a state, but we've got lots of poor people who live there. And I think that reflects, the problem that's going on across the world, in that we're increasingly becoming poor people within rich countries. And we can see that in the UK. We're seeing poverty levels rise in this country, despite the fact that we're one of the richest countries in the world. And I think what we've got to remember with our aid budget is that we're no longer rich countries supporting poor countries. We're increasingly trying to support where the poorest people are in the world. And if those poorest people do happen to live in middle-income countries, then that's where we should be directing assistance. That's not to say either way that we should or should not be giving a certain amount of aid to India, but I think the debate has to move to what we're spending the aid on. So in India's case, where actually 50% of the aid we're giving to India is actually going into what's called a sovereign wealth fund, and it's being directed to the private sector and to sort of large companies, which I think is the wrong way to approach development. We need to be targeting the poorest. We need to be ensuring that it's the poor people in these countries which are getting development assistance, not necessarily private sector actors who.
But I think how much you spend and who it goes to are both linked. I want to pick up on the 0.7% target. This is the target that David Cameron has said the country will spend. It's 0.7% of our GDP. Now that figure is based on a 40-year-old target invented by those who were lobbying for more aid. If you were actually to update the figures that those are based on, which is based on financing gap theory, you'd actually only be spending 0.05% of GDP of rich Western nations. So the idea that that aid should be based on spending inputs rather than your outputs, well, if you don't get your financing sorted at the start, you're not going to get your outcomes sorted. So I think I would take issue with the way that we actually put up this arbitrary target, which encourages government and encourages the civil servants at DFID to spend up to a point, justifying their aims not on what is it actually achieving, but how much money they are actually using their budget. Also, let's not deny that the British people are some of the most generous people out there. We do very well. We give a lot of money. But the idea that we shouldn't be actually deciding on how we spend that money, are we getting the right results? Because every committee report that you look into the way that DFID, the International Development Department, spends their money, they don't get good ratings. They get amber red, because the fact is that Lords MPs are worried about the way that they spend their money.
Lord Lipsey, can I turn to you? I mean, this 0.7% of gross national income, do you think it's an arbitrary figure?
I think it's an arbitrary figure, and I think it's an unwise commitment. Not only because it's very expensive for British taxpayers, who, though we're very generous people, are a little bit chary about how this aid money is being spent, because I think in the end of the day it's going to be bad news for the recipients of aid. You see, in order to meet that target, we have to increase official aid by 37% in the years to 2015, and that means that what will be happening is not careful selection of all the best projects where it can really make a difference. It'll be shoveling the money out of the door to meet an artificial target. And a lot of that money will end up in the wrong hands. A lot of that money will not do anything for development. And I think then that taxpayers in Britain will say, hang on, we had to pay all this money out. We're not getting anything in return. A slow, steady increase in aid is the way forward.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia. I'm Brendan Cole. We're discussing the UK's overseas aid budget with Alex Scrivener, Laura Taylor, Robert Oxley and Lord Lipsey. Obviously, Mr Cameron has been urged on many sides, but by the senior Tory peer, for instance, Lord Ashcroft, to what he says turn off the golden tap on foreign aid because it bankrolls corrupt dictators. Do you think that corruption should be a factor in whether or not poor countries should be getting money?
Corruption is a very real factor, and the inability of Britain's DFID to be very effective in combating corruption is a serious problem with the aid programme. We need it to be much more effective aid programme, if it has made some good progress in that regard. But as it were, turning the taps on full out is a sure recipe for reversing that progress.
I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points that have been raised already. The first one is about public support for aid, because there's been a poll recently by ComRes that shows that people drastically overestimate the amount of money that they think we're giving due to the way it's portrayed in the media. So when people were asked how much aid they thought we should give, they were coming up with figures about 2.5%. And over half of people thought it was more than 10% of our income. Once they learnt it was not even 0.7% yet, there was a general agreement. Over 55% said that was the right level. They should be increasing. So I don't think we should forget that. The second point I'd like to raise is about this one about corruption. Now, I think aid, and we've seen aid used very effectively to help local communities in places like Tanzania and Uganda to hold their governments to account for the way the money's been spending. So yes, it's right that DFID should shift away from just giving money to governments, and there might be some corruption issues there, although there can be some great results from giving it to governments too, but giving some to the private sector and also giving some to communities so they can check how much money is going into their education system, their schools, their hospitals, is a really effective way to tackle some of that corruption.
Alex Scrivener from the World Development Movement, your group did a study on how aid works and how it's concentrated on private sector involvement in these developing countries. What were some of the key findings?
What we found is that there's actually an increasing ideological dedication within the UK government in particular towards diverting aid towards private sector recipients as opposed to the people who perhaps are the neediest. And I mean, an example of this was as an aid project which happened a few years ago, where the UK government gave a lot of money to a private sector consultant called Adam Smith International to write a pop song extolling the virtues of privatisation. Now, I think if you asked anyone on the street, as Laura very rightly said, most people are actually quite supportive of aid and would, when asked and sort of given the full facts, support a 0.7% target. But when they're also told that our money is going towards sort of supporting ideological projects like supporting privatisation in the global south, people then quite rightly become more sceptical. And I think the real debate is, what we've had so far in this conversation is should we not spend 0.7% on aid? And I think that's not really the major debate. I think the real debate is what we spend this money on. There's no point spending 0.7% if it all goes to Nike and Adidas. It's supposed to be going to the poorest, and that's what I think the British public wants to see.
First of all, public opinion aid. Yes, there was that ingenious Comres attempt to change the figures. The figures are quite straightforward. 22% of public opinion is in favour of aid, 56% are against. Now, I'm sorry, it's not that, but that's the fact. A second falsehood that is being propagated is that there's somehow a choice between helping the private sector and helping the poorest. No, most of the growth that has been coming about in recent years in some of the developing countries has come as a result of private investment backed by public aid and by public attempts to get better governance in these countries, which is absolutely key to getting results. So let's not go down false avenues. Let's face the facts as they are, and then let's build a proper aid programme that can work on the back of that.
Well, Lord Lipsey, what kind of aid programme are you putting forward then?
I'm putting forward the kind of aid programme in which British aid has been moving, to say, working with the private sector, a strong emphasis on better governance, more emphasis in combating fraud in the use of aid, more emphasis on the projects that will in fact help the poorest, and not getting diverted by making the only thing that counts some artificial target, which can only lead to more waste going forward.
Robert Oxley, £500 million spent on consultants, so it is money well spent, isn't it?
I don't think it is money well spent, and that's why they were dubbed the aid barons, as it were. And I think you mentioned one of them, which was the ASI, obviously not anything to do with a think tank anymore, and on very different principles. I think the point here is that there are these examples where money has been highlighted, the aid budget has been spent poorly. The other fact is actually about £1.5 billion of the UK's aid budget goes to its bilateral partners in the EU, which is then we don't have control. And that's when you get reports of money being spent on hotels in Morocco, on the fact that DFID itself is spending, despite cutting the Indian aid budget in 2015, has just kitted out a brand new huge office in the Indian subcontinent. And I think the point is that when you see these examples of money being spent poorly, when you hear about companies who appear to be profiteering on aid and not necessarily getting help to the world's poorest, which is what people want the money spent on, that's why you start thinking, that's why people start losing faith in aid. But it's also the biggest case of why we shouldn't be arbitrarily increasing the budget. What we have to do is that when we are spending so much money at the moment poorly and not getting the targets that we want, and that's why we get consistent reports of saying, well, you can bring up some very good examples that overall that there are too many reports of money being wasted, money being spent poorly, money being spent poorly and money going to corruption. That if you have those examples, the idea of then increasing the amount that you're flowing out rather than actually looking at how you're spending the cash at the moment, I think that just simply doesn't make sense.
Laura Taylor, you want to weigh in there?
Well, I think it's always the case that bad news stories get huge amounts more coverage than good news stories. The fact is, DFID aid last year fed 15 million people, supplied 1.5 million people with water and sanitation, and kept 5 million children each day in a primary school. Now, recently I went to visit a hospital in the eastern part of Democratic Republic of Congo that was funded by Tear Fund and by European aid. The amazing work that it was doing to give hope to people who travel days to get to their nearest hospital in a time of conflict. And when the British public see stories like that, they do support aid and they want our money to be used as well as possible. I would argue that the cases of corruption get much more coverage than those good news stories do. And I think we need to address that balance in the coverage.
But I suppose that in terms of a British taxpayer, they like to see those, they like to hear those stories of more people going to school, of more of vaccinations and whatever. It's more important to develop private sector, to develop trade. Is that happening?
No, I think although Andrew Mitchell's had quite a lot of bad press recently, he did do a fantastic job of helping DFID to really make the case for what kind of aid delivered real value for money. And I'd say that DFID is one of the most scrutinised departments we have. With the he set up an independent audit committee. There's already the select committee that looks at their spending, and independent reviews are carried out by the World Bank and others of British aid. And we consistently get good ratings for that. And I think he is forcing DFID to look at the things that do deliver value for money over the long term.
I'll turn to Lord Lipsey. Andrew Mitchell was raised there, and he will have to answer questions over the unfreezing of aid to Rwanda. Paul Kagame last week seemed very, very cross at the fact that aid had been frozen by the European Union. What do you make of it? Do you think that this is a political condition that's been attached to aid that shouldn't really happen, should it?
Well, I don't know enough about the Rwandan situation to comment in detail. What I would say is there are all sorts of terrible dilemmas that arise in this field, because you very often have very poor people living under very unattractive governments, and you have to decide, if you punish the government, you also punish the poor people. So these are delicate matters of judgment in every case, and I have no reason to suppose that they've got the Rwanda judgment wrong. And I think it would be very sad if aid simply became a mechanism for trying to get rid of rulers we don't terribly like, without thinking of who's really going to suffer as a result of that on the ground.
Alex Scrivener, there is a degree of donor interference, though, isn't there?
Well, yeah, I mean, tide aid is a very important subject, actually. And I think one thing we've got to remember when we talk about the idea of tide aid is it's actually illegal in the United Kingdom. The World Development Movement, my organisation, back in the 1990s, we won a court case against the government over something called the Pergal Dam, which was a tide aid project the British government was pursuing in Malaysia. What happened there was British aid was tied to the sale of military equipment. So since then, basically, it's now no longer legal to do that kind of thing. So while you can tie aid to political conditionality, we don't necessarily agree with that in most cases. We actually think that this is actually coming back to a certain extent into our discourse. So, for example, Andrew Mitchell, when he was talking about aid to India, let slip that the aid programme is all about selling the Typhoon fighter aircraft, which would actually be something quite close to being illegal, because we're not allowed to use the aid budget to do anything else but to assist some of the poorest people in the world. And that's what the aid budget is for. That's what international development is all about. And if we get into this debate about whether we should tie aid and link aid to other objectives the British government has, like foreign policy, the economic development of the UK itself, then we're getting into very dangerous territory.
There is an argument, actually, that aid doesn't work, that 50 years of giving aid to, say, I'm using the example of sub-Saharan Africa, something like $1 trillion has been dispersed. More people live on less than $1 a day than 50 years ago. So, I mean, what do you make of that argument?
I would actually disagree with those figures. Looking at the data in terms of collection for the Millennium Development Goals, which is what David Cameron and other leaders were looking at last week, although progress hasn't been as fast as we'd like to eradicating extreme poverty, there are less people living on less than $1 a day now than there were in 1990 when those targets were set. And I think there are lots of reasons for that. Definitely not just aid. If you look at economic growth in places like China and India, they're important for lifting people out of poverty. And it is important. You can see in certain places that poverty is getting greater. Places like Congo, places like Sudan where there's war, or extreme weather conditions like famine. So aid is important as a safety net for those people who are most vulnerable as well.
I'll turn to you, Robert Oxley. I suppose if you look at some aid programs, really big historic aid programs that have worked, the Marshall Plan or say the Green Revolution in India, there's always been a finite exit plan, and then governments have to get up to speed. Do you think that the giving of aid continuously ad infinitum is actually a disincentive for governments to increase their effective governance.
Well, I said one of the points that I made earlier is that aid spending should be based on output, not inputs. And at the moment, we have this situation where we're basing it on a spending target. And actually, what we should be looking at is what it is achieving. And it's interesting that we spoke about trade because, obviously India didn't take the typhoon, and there was a lot of debate about whether we should have been giving money to India when they weren't going to be trading with us. And I agree that you shouldn't be linking aid to military contracts. But should we be linking it to wider political reform? Well, Rwanda is a brilliant case in point, and I actually think that had Andrew Mitchell, the former Secretary of State, not had to resign because of Plebgate, what has happened in Rwanda probably could have been his undoing, because what we have here is we have a country which is doing very well. It has some of the highest foreign direct investment in Africa, and part of that is because Paul Kagame, for all his politics, he's a businessman, and he has turned Rwanda into the internet revolution of Africa, effectively. It's a beautiful country, I've spent time there. But at the same time, politically, he has been pursuing very questionable policies in neighbouring countries and has been accused of financing military operations outside there, and was also accused of sending Rwandan hit squads to Britain to take out dissidents in this country. And I think that many people, no matter how much they want to help the poorest, the idea that their money should be spent on a regime which is actively trying to break the law in this country, that is when many people start to wonder, well, surely should the aid budget not be linked to political goals, political changes?
It's important that DFID doesn't walk away from countries like Rwanda, but I think it's legitimate to move the way that aid is being spent away from governments and directly to civil society.
But do you think that the aid model incentivises governments in sub-Saharan Africa enough to provide jobs and infrastructure and all those kinds of things? Or does it create a kind of dependence culture for them?
I really don't think we've seen much evidence of a dependency culture. I think trying to help, often we send staff into work in government departments to help them develop good policies and to help them understand how to implement those policies, which I think really helps countries to stand on their own feet in the long run. I do agree that we should look forward to a time when we don't need aid anymore. I don't think this should be something that is cast in stone forever, but I do think that making sure that we meet our promises now actually helps us to stop having to give aid maybe 20 or 30 years down the line, because by making the investment now, we can hopefully be in a situation where countries are strong enough to survive.
I think what's very important to remember when we're talking about this is that aid is not development. These things are not synonyms. These things are not interchangeable in any way. Aid is very important. Aid can help poor countries, but it's only ever going to be a sticking plaster. Aid is very unlikely to solve the structural problems of poverty that we're seeing across the world. If we want to see that, if we want to see an end to poverty, if we want to see an end to aid, in fact, what we need is structural economic changes in the way the world works. We need a move away from what our countries are doing in terms of promoting unfair trade models. We need to move away from the kind of political structure which actually means everything's actually weighed against these poor countries.
But with regard to the trade models, say European Union, the Common Agricultural Policy, and obviously US tariffs and things, basically that will never change. So shouldn't Africa look to, well, we can't get our goods into Europe, but let's form another trade bloc. Let's look to Asia. Let's look to South America. Maybe that is a better approach.
Something to be said for that, actually. Yes, the problem is that while we have tariffs and restrictions on access to our markets, we preach through the World Bank and IMF the doctrine of free markets and open access to their markets.
But isn't that the
problem?
So
it's hypocrisy, really.
But Washington consensus organisations like the IMF and the World Bank are calling the shots in Africa. These are right-wing free market institutions.
Well, exactly.
That's wholly unsuited to Africa.
Yeah, exactly. That's why the World Development Movement is actually calling for the abolishment of the World Bank completely, because we think it's a discredited institution. We actually think that we need a new paradigm, a new way of promoting development in Africa and Asia. We need institutions which are not ideologically dedicated to the Washington consensus, as you've just said. We need a new way of promoting fair trade between the South and the North, and promoting trade within these countries, and South-South cooperation as well.
Laura Taylor, what about things like bond markets and things like that? Is that another possibility that African countries can look at?
The reality is Africa is changing really quickly. In recent visits myself, I've seen huge evidence of the Chinese and the way that they are investing in infrastructure in Africa, as well as Japan and other countries. So while we've been talking about the World Bank and the IMF and other organisations having had influence in Africa, I think in reality that influence is declining, whether or not we want that or not. I think bond markets obviously could help, but they've got to be structured in the way that African countries have a fair shot compared to other countries when they've got much less resources to put into things.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia. I'm Brendan Cole. We're discussing the UK's overseas aid budget. With me is Alex Scrivener, the Policy Officer for the World Development Movement, Laura Taylor, Head of Public Policy at the Relief and Development Agency Tear Fund, Robert Oxley, Campaign Manager at Taxpayers Alliance, and David Lipsey, Member of the Economic Affairs Committee in the House of Lords. But with regard to China, I mean, that's an interesting point. How is China viewed in Africa? Is it viewed as doing something good? It's building infrastructure and roads and all that sort of stuff, but it does come at a price. It has to supply China with resources, and but China, in a way, is doing the job that the EU should be doing or the US should be doing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's in some places, Africa's a love-hate relationship with China. They are doing great stuff to invest in roads and hospitals, and I think the capacity of Africa to negotiate a good deal with China is really important, and there's probably work that through our aid and other political support we could do to help African countries with that. I mean, there's another thing that we can do. We can get our own laws in order. So at the moment, the EU is just about to pass a regulation that all oil, gas and mining companies are listed on the American and the EU stock markets, which 4 out of the 5 big Chinese companies will have to publish what they're paying to African governments to help tackle corruption in that sector. So through our own law courts, we can help make sure that Chinese companies have to be more transparent about what they're doing.
Robert Oxley, we should take a leaf out of China's book in terms of investment in Africa, shouldn't we?
Well, I think the irony of talking about, firstly, the EU as one of those groups which are, preventing African trade with the cap, with tariffs. This is an organisation, yet we're still handing money from Britain to run our aid project there. So I think there's a deep irony on expecting the EU to promote aid while also actually undermining trade, which damages African countries. With China, look, from my personal experience on the ground, it is very much a love-hate relationship, and a lot of there's a lot of negative feeling towards how China is buying up resources in Africa, and also how the money that it is investing into that country isn't being spread and is actually just being very much concentrated in the political elite. And we've seen strikes in mines. We've seen a reaction to that. And I think that's something that the Western world and possibly those involved in aid, they don't necessarily see that on the ground. It's a personal experience there, and I have seen it many times over. But the idea is that what we have to demand, with less money in our pockets and with very ideal but lofty goals, is that we need to make sure that every penny is spent wisely. And at a time when you can be clear that we're not spending every penny wisely, why are we then deciding actually the answer to the fact that some of our money is being spent unwisely is to increase the amount that we're handing over? I don't think that is right.
The Millennium Development Goals expire in 2015. Alex Scrivener, what should happen after then?
Well, I think we need to have new goals, but these new goals shouldn't be just focused on the symptoms of poverty as the old goals were. They need to be focused on the root causes. So they shouldn't just apply to poor countries and tell us what we should be aiming for. They should also be telling us the how. We need to be fighting for fairer trade across the world. We need to be fighting for gender equality. We need to be fighting for all the things that will actually help us reach those goals, as opposed to just saying that we want 50% people less to be in poverty, which I'm sure we all want. Actually, I don't think that's anywhere near enough. I think I wouldn't be satisfied until we get rid of absolute poverty and extreme poverty from the entire world. But I think the important thing with the MDGs is we need to have a new set of rules which actually focus on the structural issues as opposed to just the issues on the outside.
So I'd very much agree with Alex that looking at the root causes is important. I think with the Millennium Development Goals, it's good to raise up sort of some of the less poor to help meet the targets, but some of the poorest can get left behind while we've still met the goals. So a greater focus on equity and equality issues in the goals, and on sustainability. If we develop outside of the bounds that our environment can cope, we're in trouble. So making sure that we develop in an environmentally sustainable way and a way that's fairer.
Well, sadly, we've run out of time. Thank you for joining me, Robert Oxley, Campaign Manager at Taxpayers Alliance, Laura Taylor, Head of Public Policy at the Relief and Development Agency Tear Fund, Alex Scrivener, who's the Policy Officer for the World Development Movement, and David Lipsey, Member of the Economic Affairs Committee in the House of Lords. Thank you for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.
Growth, which is great. There's still more people living on less than $1 a day in India than there is in the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. So although that growth is happening, more does need to be done to make sure that it's spread out more evenly to help the people living in greatest need. So it might be genuinely the case that the UK should exit aid to India, and that's what we've stated, the government stated they'll do. But how we do that, making sure that the most marginalised are protected, is really important. And I think that's why they're staggering that exit. For us, we've decided to focus on the most vulnerable, people living with HIV, children who might be trafficked, or education for the most marginalised, like the Dalits. So I think it's a good debate to have, but we mustn't forget the poorest.
Alex Scrivener, does this go to the heart of the effectiveness of who the UK decides to give aid to?
What we've got to remember with India is that it's not the amount that we give necessarily that's very important, it's what we're spending the money on. And I think we've also got to remember that in India, we've got a country which is incredibly...
All government departments are having to make necessary savings, and they're having to do more for less. The idea that the international aid budget should also be protected from those pressures. It's not about cutting aid. It's about saying that we can do more with what we've got at the moment. And India, a country which has a space program, which spends money on defence projects such as the latest fighter jets, why is it that we are handing money over to there to rightly address poverty, but why is it not India's own responsibility to do that?
Laura Taylor, what do you make of this, the issue of giving aid to India?
Picking up on what Robert said, I think it is really important that the debate really focuses at the moment about whether or not we should be giving 0.7% in aid. And I think David Cameron has really strongly said that he feels there's a public mandate to do that, and he's committed to doing it. But the debate about how to spend that 0.7% is a really valid and genuine one to have. And at Tearfund ourselves, we've been thinking about which countries we do and don't support aid to. Now, India's a really interesting case, because although there is encouraging and really quick economic...
What should be the UK's role in providing aid to developing countries? Should it give more? Should it ask for more in return? Well, to discuss this and other issues, I'm joined by Alex Scrivener, who's the Policy Officer for the World Development Movement, which campaigns on issues of global justice and development in the Global South. Laura Taylor, who's Head of Public Policy at the Relief and Development Agency Tearfund. Robert Oxley, who's Campaign Manager at Taxpayers Alliance. And on the line, we have David Lipsey, who's a member of the Economic Affairs Committee in the House of Lords. Thank you very much for joining me on The Voice of Russia. Robert Oxley, I'll start with you. It does seem a bit daft, doesn't it, to be giving £250,000 a year to a country that has a space programme?
Well, we have long argued that the aid budget can be spent in a more appropriate way, and I think the fact that Justine Greening, the Secretary of State for International Development, has recognised that she needs to cut back on the funds, the £280 million a year that goes to India, proves that point. The point here, though, is that the government still is waiting a while to get rid of this programme. It's up until 2015 that the aid budget will continue on to India, and I think at a case when...
Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Brendan Cole. David Cameron has said there is a real opportunity to end extreme global poverty within the next few decades. Last week, the British Prime Minister co-chaired a meeting of politicians from around the world to discuss anti-poverty strategies. Mr. Cameron has been asked by the UN to look into how poverty in developing countries should be tackled after 2015. He's reaffirmed his pledge to increase Britain's aid budget to 0.7% of gross national income. Meanwhile, the International Development Secretary will this week unveil plans to slash Britain's controversial £280 million a year budget to India, amid claims the country is too rich to need handouts. The move also comes amid mounting criticism that Britain's overseas aid programme, which is set to reach more than £12 billion by 2014, cannot be justified at a time of spending cuts back home. So, just what
rich as a state, but we've got lots of poor people who live there. And I think that reflects, the problem that's going on across the world, in that we're increasingly becoming poor people within rich countries. And we can see that in the UK. We're seeing poverty levels rise in this country, despite the fact that we're one of the richest countries in the world. And I think what we've got to remember with our aid budget is that we're no longer rich countries supporting poor countries. We're increasingly trying to support where the poorest people are in the world. And if those poorest people do happen to live in middle-income countries, then that's where we should be directing assistance. That's not to say either way that we should or should not be giving a certain amount of aid to India, but I think the debate has to move to what we're spending the aid on. So in India's case, where actually 50% of the aid we're giving to India is actually going into what's called a sovereign wealth fund, and it's being directed to the private sector and to sort of large companies, which I think is the wrong way to approach development. We need to be targeting the poorest. We need to be ensuring that it's the poor people in these countries which are getting development assistance, and not necessarily private sector actors who...
But I think how much you spend